strength. And so I was so thrilled when Arthur agreed to come on the podcast. So Arthur, welcome to the Andy Stanley Leadership Podcast.
Thank you, Andy. What a delight it is to be with you. I've been looking forward to this too. Thank you for the good work that you're doing to improve leadership and improve people's lives.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Before we jump into the content, just for the half dozen or so folks who don't know who you are, Arthur Brooks is the William Henry Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School and Professor of Management Practice at the Harvard Business School. Before joining the Harvard faculty, he served for 10 years as president of the Washington, D.C.-based American Enterprise Institute, one of the world's largest and leading think tanks, and he talks a good bit about that in the book. He's also the author of 11 books, or 10 other books, I guess, including the national bestseller, Love Your Enemies, that came out in 2019. He's a columnist for The Atlantic. He's the host of his podcast, The Art of Happiness. And this was such a cool thing, he's the subject of the 2019 documentary film, The Pursuit, which was named one of the best documentaries on Netflix in 2019, which is a really big deal. He is a sought-after conference speaker in the U.S., in Europe, and Asia. And so, again, we are so honored that he chose to spend a few minutes with us today on the podcast. So, Arthur, as we get started, would you kind of give us, for those who are unfamiliar with the book, what is sort of the big picture message of From Strength to Strength? And then we'll dive into some details.
Well, this is a book written for people who are trying to do a lot with their lives. And, I guess everybody wants to do a lot with their lives, but not everybody's trying to do a lot with their lives. And that means a lot of different things to different people. Some people are workaholics, super ambitious people. Other people are just trying to live up to, God's plan for their life and just doing the best that they possibly can. The problem is there's no manual for how you can do the best you can with the resources at your disposal. And nobody tells you how the tools that you have are going to change. And the truth of the matter is that the harder you work and the better you are at what you do, and the harder that you drive toward your ambition, the more you're going to come face to face with the fact that it's going to look like you've got burnout problems, that you've got decline problems happening much earlier. Earlier than you think. That's the first thing I confront the readers with in this book, which is that in almost every profession, especially professions that use our minds as much as our hands, that most people they tend to peak in their their effectiveness in their late 30s, and by their 40s they're tending to find themselves a little bit burned out, and they find that nobody else is going to notice because they're so good at what they do, but they're going to notice that they're not making progress anymore, and that creates panic, it creates problems, it creates depression and anxiety, and there's a solution to it, but you got to know the science and change your approach to life. That's what this book is all about.
Well, so I hope you don't take offense to this, but every time I recommend this book, I say, no, look, you're going to have to make yourself finish the first chapter.
I know.
And so you have to keep reading this book because you appropriately and brilliantly carve us all down to a nub, in terms of how we view ourselves, force us to face some reality. And again, this is why I just don't think a person can read this book early enough. So the other thing is the story of how you got interested in this is so fascinating. So tell us a little bit about why this became a passion for you.
Well, I've been a real striver my whole life, like a lot of people. You don't listen to the Andy Stanley podcast unless you're a striver. No slacker is going to say, I think I'm going to listen to the Andy Stanley podcast so I can feel crummy about myself. No, you people listen to this podcast so they can get fired up and be better at what they do. And that is certainly the case for me. I've been working hard my whole life. I don't think I've ever worked less than 60 or 70 hours a week. I've done a lot of different things. But the truth of the matter is that I noticed I was losing steam in my 40s. I was running a company. I was running a big think tank in Washington, D.C. I was feeling less interested in my work. I had energy, but it just wasn't the same, man. And I was wondering what's wrong with me. And during that time, thinking, where is this going to lead? Maybe I can get a second wind. I don't know. I had this chance encounter on an airplane. I overheard a guy behind me on an airplane one night. I was flying from Washington or from LA to Washington, D.C., long flight, 11 o'clock at night. And I heard him confessing to his wife that he might as well be dead, that nobody remembered him anymore, that nobody cared about him anymore. I could tell he was elderly, and I thought, well, at least I'm not that, right? Because that guy obviously didn't live. He never did anything with his life, obviously. Now he's really disappointed because it's nearly over. We get to Washington, D.C., and the lights turn on, and we all stand up. And I just, I'm a behavioral scientist. I want to see the person on whom I've been eavesdropping. Look, my research laboratory is overheard conversations, right? I'm a social scientist. And I turned around, and it was one of the most famous men in the world. This is somebody that we all know. This is somebody who's achieved 10x what I'm going to do. He's a legitimate hero. He's changed the course of American life because of his achievements in the 1960s and 1970s. For the better, he's made the world. And I heard him confessing to his wife he might as well be dead because his achievements were so far in the past, he didn't have anything to live for or look forward to anymore. I thought, man, this is a rock in my world, because the world tells you work hard, play by the rules, achieve like crazy, be successful, bank it, die happy. And that's wrong. The truth of the matter is you need a current plan to continue to create value with your life, and your skills and abilities and strengths are going to change. So you better know what that's going to mean, and you better plug into what you do well so that you can adapt according to your abilities as you get older.
Well, that opening illustration that you come back to at the end of the book is so compelling. And I'm sure every person who's ever read this book who met you was like, tell me who it is.
I know.
They all want to know. That's a best kept secret.
Well, it's off limits, and the only reason, a couple of different reasons. Number one is that, I made a deal with my publisher that I would take it to my grave. But more practically speaking, it could be so many people. And who would want to defame somebody's reputation simply to make a point, or for the curiosity that comes from that? Look, we're all cut from the same cloth. We got feet of clay is the whole point. And we should be able to learn from each other from both strengths and weaknesses.
So, as we talked about a little bit before we began, you're not the first person to enter this space and write into this space in terms of second half and figuring out what's next and all those sorts of things. And I've read some of those books, but honestly, your insights and your solutions are unique, and your applications are extremely practical. And I'm going to try not to interrupt you in the next 2 or 3 minutes to tell you what I learned from the book, because this is for our listeners. So tease this out a little bit and talk about these different kinds of intelligence, because that's kind of the framework going forward.
Yeah. So what I set out to do after having this experience, I went home and I told my wife, Esther, I said, sweetheart, I do not want to be having that conversation with you on the plane 40 years from now. I do not want to be telling you that I might as well be dead. And she said, well, look, you suffered through it. You're a social scientist. You got a PhD for a reason, right? Why don't you use that knowledge for something practical and solve the problem?
A good wife. Yeah,
she's awesome.
A good wife. Yeah,
she leads me in paths of righteousness. Yeah. If I get into heaven, it's because of my wife. But she wants me to be happy on this side of the mortal coil too. And I said, yeah, it makes perfect sense. So my goal was to see, do people who are successful, do they tend to be happier or unhappier in old age, and how can I be happier and actually create a lot of value? dedicating my work to the good of others and the glory of God and all the things and enjoy it. So how can I get all of those things at the same time, if it's possible? And one of the first things that I found is that people who tend to be most disappointed with their lives after 70 are the people who have the most success early in their lives. I did not expect that. I expected to find that people who are more successful earlier would be happier later, and it's the opposite for a couple of different reasons. Number one is that hard-charging strivers tend to have unbelievably high standards for themselves. It's really hard to live up to your mother's standards. It's even harder to live up to your own standards. And when you get old, it's going to be that much harder, and you're not going to see the kind of success coming, and that's going to be incredibly disappointing. That's number one. Number two is just the contrast between the big party that you've had and the fact that it's over is very disappointing. So the result of that is that you need to think very differently about the second half of your life than you do the first half of your life. You can't keep doing what you were doing and hoping that you'll be able to enjoy it and it won't diminish and it won't wind up bringing you a whole lot of bitterness and unhappiness. So that leads to the big solution to how to be successful and playing to your strengths and get happier as you get older. And the number one thing to keep in mind is that your intelligence changes. Now, this is a big neuroscientific and social scientific point that I make in the book, and the book is based around this idea. There's two intelligence curves. Now, everybody knows about IQ and knows about, you're able to get a good SAT score, whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about two different kinds of intelligence that you have in the early part of your life and the later part of your life. In the early part of your life, you have an abundance, what social psychologists call fluid intelligence. That's working memory, that's innovative capacity, that's the ability to focus. You get much better at doing what you're doing because you hone your skills, and just through raw horsepower, 10,000 hours of practice, you get much better at it. So everybody who's listening to us right now and who's a financial planner or a lawyer or a doctor, or all the people that want to be better leaders, business leaders, or, even people who are not in traditional businesses, but they got a lot of responsibilities, they get better and better and better through the 20s and 30s, just based on their hard work and personal responsibility. All of those abilities, based on your ability to solve problems, innovate, remember things, those all peak in your late 30s or early 40s and start to decline.
Now, I have to stop you there because that is the part of the book where everybody goes, what?
Uh-oh.
Late 20s, 30s? Everybody's thinking, no, 40s and 50s.
Yeah, or 60s. Yeah.
This is an important revelation, and to acknowledge that. Anyway, I just didn't want you to fly by that, because people are going to think, did I hear that correctly?
I know. 39 is the magic age. 39 is the year of highest productivity and quality for surgeons, financial planners, Wall Street brokers, for electricians, for judges, for classical musicians, for writers. It's uncanny. Scientists. 39.
So you're over the hill at 30.
Yeah, well, no, you're at your max at 39. The problem is then you're over the hill. You're on the wrong side of the hill. And the key thing is you can be pretty close to the top of your game, but if you're not getting better, you don't like it. God made us to make progress. That's how he wired us, to make progress. Keep going. Yep. He wanted us to keep going across the Sinai and get into the promised land, the land of milk and honey. He didn't be like, it's pretty good in the Sinai, let's stay here. That's not how God made us. That's my view. But that's actually how evolutionary biologists understand the human species as well. That's the reason that my dentist at 43, she's a great dentist. She's the best dentist in town. She stopped working Fridays and started golfing. I was like, do you like golfing? She says, no, I hate golfing, but I got to do something because I'm so burnt out. How are you burnt out? The reason is she didn't know it. She's still great. She wasn't making progress. She was making regress. That's the bad news. That's the 2x4 across the chops that you talked about in the first chapter of this book. Yep. Okay, now the good news. There's a second intelligence curve that comes in behind it that you get better and better and better at in your 40s and 50s and 60s, and you stay high in your 70s and 80s and 90s if you've got your marbles. That's called crystallized intelligence. That does not require working memory, thank God. I can't remember anything anymore. It does not require innovative capacity. What it requires is pattern recognition and good judgment and tons of wisdom. In other words, when you're in your 20s and 30s, you can solve any problem. When you're in your 50s and 60s, you know which problems to solve. In your 20s and 30s, you're the hot shot. In your 50s and 60s, you can identify the next generation of hot shots. That's why you should be a startup entrepreneur at 35, and you should be a venture capitalist at 60. You should be the star litigator at 35. You should be the managing partner at 65. That's what exploits these different intelligence curves. Here's the problem, Andy. Everybody who's got this unbelievably high fluid intelligence and hard work and just offering it up and just digging it, man, they want to stay on that curve forever. And they end up surfing that curve all the way back down through their 40s and 50s and wondering what's wrong with them. Answer, nothing. You got to get on the next curve, even if it's hard, even if it's scary. And that's what this book is, how to do it.
Wow. Before we continue, as I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, our sponsor, Belay, is offering their leadership toolkit free to our listeners. With it, you'll learn steps you can take as a leader to accomplish more and juggle less. Again, just text the word Andy, A-N-D-Y, to 55123. That's Andy to 55123 to get access to this toolkit. And in no time, you will be back to doing what only you can do, which is growing your organization. So practically speaking, what if you could kind of condense, and let me just say to our listeners, regardless of how good this conversation is, you got to get this book. We're skipping over so much stuff. But anyway, the majority of folks listening are probably between 25 and 55. So what is kind of the takeaway as they think about second half happiness, or again, making the jump from fluid to crystallized intelligence?
So the key thing is, if you get on your second curve, then you will be happier than you were in the first part of your life. Greater happiness is in your future. By the way, a better marriage is in your future. A better relationship with your kids is in your future. A better understanding of your relationship with God is in your future. But you got to get on that second curve, because that's when you're in the zone of your maximum effectiveness, and that's when you're living up to what you can uniquely do well. It takes humility, because you have to step back from it. It requires that you exhibit a lot of virtues, like, as I said, humility, but also a whole lot of courage, a whole lot of ability to say, this isn't going to go in the right direction, but I'm confident that there's something better in my future. Okay, then there's a whole bunch of things to do. There's a whole bunch of things to do that makes it easier and more fun to begin with.
Make this sound fun for us, please.
Yeah, the number one thing that people get wrong when they're stuck on their first curve, when they're stuck trying to do what they always did, and it's getting harder and more boring and more turgid, and they hate it. The one thing that they all have in common is that they think that they're going to be happier if they're doing more, getting more, experiencing more, meeting more people, having more of everything. What all people who are really good at getting older have in common, who get older and are happier have in common, is they start to master the art of subtraction as opposed to addition. One of the things that we find is that everybody on the first curve, satisfaction comes to them as a function of all the things that they have. And their formula for more satisfaction is having more. That doesn't just mean more money. It also means more power and more experiences and more relationships and more prestige and more admiration and more adulation, more. But the key thing that everybody learns who masters this is that your satisfaction is a function of all the things that you have divided by all the things that you want. In other words, you learn...
Say that again.
Yeah, haves divided by wants. Now think about that. That's a fraction. That model is very important, because one way to have more satisfaction is to have more, but that's inefficient. When you've got a lot already, that numerator is huge. What you need is to be efficient, is to start managing your wants. If you start decreasing the denominator, decreasing your wants, you're going to find so much more satisfaction than you've had in the past. Wow. Every year on your birthday, after 45, you should have a reverse bucket list. All the stuff that you're not going to be attached to anymore, all the things that you're going to give away, all the things that are distracting you from the things that you really want, the better marriage that you need, the greater worship that you need, the understanding of your life that you need, that's being distracted by the stuff, the toxic relationships, the dumb things that you do every day, the ambitions that are weighing you down. All of the people on the second curve who are really successful and happy, what they have in common is that they have a subtraction strategy about their own lives as opposed to just an addition strategy.
And that is so not intuitive.
Totally, man. I mean,
let me just tell you a breakthrough moment for me as I was reading this book, because it falls into that category. You tell a story about, I don't know if these were your words you used to describe this man or if this was his words. I can't remember. But essentially, you were explaining this to someone, and they just weren't willing to do it. And essentially, you said on their behalf, or they said that, I'm going to read this to you, that they would rather be special than happy.
Yeah.
They would rather be special than happy. When I read that, for the first time in my life, I was willing to acknowledge that I like being special.
Yeah.
And that could be the thing that in my refusal to give up the, what I'm doing, where I'm doing it, who I know, why I get invited, all that stuff. I went home and told Sandra, I said, listen to this. And I've gotten up in front of our entire staff and talked about this to say, hey, I don't think I was ever willing to admit to myself how addicted I am to being special. But that trade-off, special to happy,
it's a game changer.
Talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
It's an absolute game changer. So one of the things that's worth keeping in mind, a lot of people, they're not big hippies listening to us, but they have kind of the hippie mantra that if it feels good, do it. That if something you really, really want something, if you follow your instincts, it must be because that's going to make you happier. That's wrong. Mother Nature only has two goals for you and me and everybody listening to us. She wants you to survive and pass on your genes. She does not care if you're happy. Happy is not selected in evolutionary terms. It's just not. Now, if we think about it, for those of us who are people of faith, you've got animal nature and you've got divine nature. If you just do what feels good, you're following your animal nature and you're going to pass on your genes and you're going to survive. Your divine nature is to bring you closer to the source of good in your life, and that's what's going to bring happiness. And that means you're going to have to do a lot of things that don't feel natural. Look, sin feels natural. Sin doesn't feel unnatural. The problem is sin is the most natural thing, right? That's what it means to be fallen. But the point is that we rebel against our nature, and that's what brings us to divinity. That's what brings us to where we're really supposed to be as people. Okay, now back to the whole conundrum. The story that you're talking about, I was talking to this woman my age on Wall Street. She's, I'm in my late 50s and she's in her late 50s and she's killing it, dude. She's made probably $1 billion. She has a firm named after her. She's doing everything right. Okay, but you talk to her and she says, yeah, are you happy? No. Why not? Well, my husband and I were roommates. I think I have a kind of a cordial relationship with my kids. I'm not making crisp decisions in my firm. I don't like it as much as I used to, but I don't know what else to do. I'm drinking too much. The doctor's giving me bad reports. What do I do, professor? And I'm like, you don't need a Harvard nerd to tell you what to do. You know exactly what to do. You just told me, step back from your firm, take a souvenir in your company, go away with your husband, get back into church, go to Alcoholics Anonymous. Come on, man. What are you doing? Why are you? She says, I know. I say, so why not? And she says, because I always chose to be special rather than happy. Boom, man, mic drop. Yeah. Because I'm not going to kid you, Andy. Me too. When she said that, it was like a knife to my heart. I can't tell you. I was a CEO before I did this, before I was teaching at Harvard. And I can't tell you the number of nights that I worked the 14th hour as opposed to going for the first hour with my children. And I missed those years. They grew up. Now, I don't have to repeat those errors because in 2 weeks, I'm going to be a grandfather. You probably already are, right?
Just 4 months ago.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And with my adult children, by the way, each one of them spends time with me every day, whether they like it or not. and part of the reason is because I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be happy as opposed to continuing to be special in this particular way. But if you follow your animal nature, if you follow your instincts and your urges, you will always choose special. And if you choose special, you're simply not going to have the happiness that comes. And the happiness comes because of love. Specialness comes because of achievement. Happiness comes because of love.
That's amazing. You touched on this earlier. One of the obstacles to even moving in this direction is our pride or our lack of humility. I wrote down 2 quotes from the book that, again, I just carried around in my notes. So just comment on these. To share your weakness without caring what other people think is kind of a superpower.
Yeah.
To share your weakness without caring what other people think is kind of a superpower. And the second one was this: sharing weakness is the ultimate subversion against your special, objectified self. The concept of an objectified self is so powerful. And I've never heard that phrase before, but that's exactly what we do. We objectify ourselves, and that makes me special, and I have to maintain special. And around and round and round I go. And then talk about that whole humility thing, because it takes humility to step off the treadmill.
Totally. Totally. But that humility is truly one of the great game-changing things that, and again, I mean, we learn this in every philosophy and theology class, that, you're driven toward these vices and that the heavenly virtues that accompany them don't feel natural, and yet they are what actually will bring bliss, is what it comes down to. Humility is a perfect case. The deadliest of the deadly sins in Dante's Inferno is pride. And how does pride work? You're holding yourself up as something unbelievably special all the time, and you will live in fear. You will live in absolute mortified fear of anything that threatens your ego or threatens your vision of who you're supposed to be as a person. Now, we all grew up. I mean, most of us grew up in good families. I mean, my father would have said it's a grave sin for you to objectify a woman, for you to reduce a woman to her physical characteristics and her good looks and then use her in any way. That's sinful. Woe be unto you. I'm sure your father taught you the same thing, and we're trying to teach our sons the same thing. Yep. And yet we do that to ourselves. Yep. Not physically. On the contrary, you say, okay, why am I a workaholic? Why am I a workaholic? Because I'm addicted to success. Why am I addicted to success? Because I just want to be the special one. What is the special one? The rich CEO. That's the special one. That is an object. That is reducing myself to my job characteristics and my money. And that is a sinful thing to do. Plus, it will make me miserable. So what do you have to do? You have to say, basically, I'm just a guy. I'm just a guy. I'm just a guy like any other person. And to declare your humility and your weakness. This is St. Paul's characteristic insight. He said, when I'm weak, I am strong. In the epistles of Paul, when he's talking to the Corinthians about the thorn in his flesh, he's admitting that he's just mortal. He's admitting that he's not strong. Why? Because he wants to connect himself in a mortal way. The shortest verse in the Bible is John 11:35. 2 words. Jesus wept. Why? Because he was connecting himself at the weakest point to what it meant to be a person. And yet, I'm so special, I'm so strong, I'm so awesome that I couldn't even live up to the standard of my Savior in John 11:35. That's craziness. That is complete craziness. Wow. So here's the thing. If you can break through that veil, if you can get there, man, if you can get through it and say, I'm weak, I'm not so special. It's interesting. I just did this analysis. I did this research because I write this column in the Atlantic every week. And I just wrote this column. It's going to come out in a few weeks, maybe about the time that this episode airs, about why is it that so many young people are miserable today. And the answer fundamentally is that they're lonely and they're isolated and they don't have romance. They're a third less likely to be in love than we were in the 1980s when we were that age. Why? And the answer is because they have attachment avoidance. It's an attachment style that psychologists call avoidant attachment. Why? And the reason is because they have been told their whole lives that they're the special one. When you're the special one, it's a force field against loving others and being loved.
Everybody in our studio is dying laughing. That's pretty brilliant. It is say that again. The feeling of being special is a force field against.
It's a force field against loving and being loved. Wow. It's like your plexiglass shield against the things that you most want. So you're walking around saying, I'm so lonely. I just want to find a partner. I just want love. And somebody comes toward you and they bump into your specialness. That plexiglass
and you bump into theirs too. If both people are trying to be most special, it's not going to work.
It's like, lay it on the line, man. Lay it on the line that you're weak and you need love and you're lonely and it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. Let's all say it together. I'm pathetic and so are you. Right.
That's right. Love me the way I am. And by the way, they will. They will love you the way that you are.
So any sort of high-level tips about discovering your crystallized intelligence? You have so much in the book about how to figure out what's next based on, because they're connected. The fluid intelligence crystallized, they're connected.
Absolutely. So the fluid intelligence is interesting because it's your instructor curve. Think about it as your fluid intelligence is your Mark Zuckerberg innovation curve. Your crystallized intelligence is your professor curve. That's where you share your knowledge. That's where you share your wisdom. Now, what are you going to be good at? Identifying talent, finding patterns, using your experience. That's what it comes down to. So the way to think about this is, in my world, whatever it happens to be, I used to be inventing new things. I want to find the next group of people that are going to be inventing new things. I want to be helping the next group of people that are going to be working hard. I want to find some way to become a teacher. Now, that means different things for different people. As I mentioned before, a venture capitalist is a teacher of young entrepreneurs. You're teaching with this podcast. You couldn't have done such a good, this podcast has millions of listeners. If you had done this 30 years ago when you were in your early 30s, this would not have been successful. Maybe you were that good, but you know what? The reason that this is important is because you're talking to me, and every question you're asking me, I can tell it. I can tell what you're doing right now because you're a master teacher. You're trying to draw answers out of me that are going to teach the people who are listening to us. You are on your teaching curve. That's why this is the right thing for you to do. Okay, every single person listening to us who's going from their 30s to their 40s to their 50s, say, what is the teaching version of me? Maybe It's literally teaching.
That's a great question.
I quit my job as a CEO and became a professor.
What is the teaching version of me?
That's the question.
And you think that everyone can discover an answer to that question regardless?
Every single person. You're going from your parent curve to your grandparent curve. Think about it that way, right? Wow. Where you're sitting in a rocking chair saying profound things as opposed to running around trying to solve every problem. There's a version of this. And interestingly, I talk to a lot of people about this, and a lot of people will ask me, how's it different than men and women? And it's a very interesting difference between the two. Women are much better at getting on their crystallized intelligence curves. Now, especially women who had a more conventional first half of their life. So, for example, women who stayed home with their kids and raised their families and used their fluid intelligence curves to raise their kids, they have a very seamless way. They find a lot of ease in stepping onto their crystallized intelligence curve because sometimes it's the first time that they've worked full-time outside the home. And so they just go and do what people want them to do and they're naturally good at. Meanwhile, their husbands are depressed and having a hard time. They're like, I don't know, man. I used to be good. I'm so burnt out. I'm so depressed. And their wives are like, yeah, I don't know, man. I'm having a great time here. Life is pretty sweet. So there's a path for everybody. For some people, it's harder. And the more successful you are on your fluid intelligence curve, the harder it's going to be to have this confidence, which means you're going to have to put your heart into it and offer it up.
Wow. Well, as you could tell, I could talk to you all afternoon. And this book, I know you've written 10 other books. Did I get that right?
So, who's counting? You mean good books or bad books? I've written a lot of bad books.
You've written some other books.
Yeah.
But this book is a gift to all the strivers. And that's the word you use in the book, the strivers. Yeah. So for all the strivers out there, content junkies, trying to get it better, trying to go forward. And I think what Arthur said, we are created to make progress. We're created to move things forward. And that's the natural thing we need to lean into. And this is not a matter of not making any more progress. It's just getting off the first phase of progress to really make more progress the way that we were wired.